Book 1 of Plato's Republic is essentially negative. It tells us what justice is not. The structure of the first dialogue is in 4 parts. The first part is the opening, so we're going to go through each of these in order in this video. Part 1, the opening. The very first line of Plato's Republic. Socrates goes down to the Piraeus. The reason Socrates goes down to the Piraeus is, first of all, literal, because the Piraeus is a port town below Athens, so you would have to walk from Athens in order to get there, about 8 kilometers. But the second reason some thinkers argue, like D.C. Schindler, is Plato's inviting us to think of this first book as taking place in the world of appearances. Socrates goes down to the Piraeus because it's like the philosopher going down to the cave. This is a key theme in the Republic, the ascent and descent of the philosopher through the levels of being. The philosopher ascends to the truth and descends to the world of appearances. Socrates says that philosophy is an ascent to what is, or an upward journey from appearance to reality. When Socrates goes down to the Piraeus, he's actually going down into the cave, into the world of appearances, where truth and reality don't exist. It's a world of images, of facsimiles. And as we'll see with the different thinkers' definitions of justice, this holds up, that they're definitions borrowed from poets, from tradition, or in the case of Thrasymachus, that he doesn't believe that justice exists at all, the case of a pure relativist. This very first page of the Republic tells you what the book is going to be about. Socrates and Glaucon, who is Plato's brother in real life, and so is Adamantius, who will become a main character later on in the dialogue, were down in Piraeus to see the festivities. The festivities were the introduction of a Thracian goddess, Bendis, goddess of a hunt like Artemis, into the Greek panoply. They've finished the festivities and they've prayed and they're going to return to Athens, but their return is interrupted by a slave boy who works for Polemarchus. Polemarchus' name means war leader. He's essentially a young aristocrat, more wealthy and well-heeled than Socrates, but a lot his younger. The slave boy tells Socrates, Polemarchus orders you to wait. Polemarchus catches up to them and tells Socrates, do you see how many we are? You must prove stronger than we are, or you will have to stay here. Socrates says, isn't there another option? That I can persuade you to let us go. Polemarchus says, how can you persuade them if they won't listen to any arguments? This is key for the entire Republic, really. In the first page, how can you reason with people if they won't listen to reason? This is the problem of the sophists. For a lot of the Athenian democracy was that they would no longer listen to reason. They didn't care about the truth. They just cared about influence and power and winning arguments. So here we see Socrates, the guy who has the knowledge and wisdom, is being ordered around by Polemarchus, a guy who doesn't have knowledge or wisdom, but has a lot more power. This is key to the dynamic between power and truth, or power and wisdom, that takes place in the Republic. Part 2, Cephalus. Polemarchus gets his way and Socrates and Glaucon follow the group of lads back to Polemarchus' house, or more accurately, the house of his father, Cephalus. When they come to the house, Cephalus is there. He's sitting in the center of the room on a cushioned stool. He's crowned with a wreath because he's just performed a sacrifice in the courtyard. He's the man of the house. He's a senior figure. He's even older than Socrates. And in Athens, that commands respect. Cephalus' name literally means old head. So he's wealthy and old, upper class, and he represents the old tradition of Athens. We'll see even in his definition of justice, he gives the typical definition of justice. It's interesting how Socrates approaches him. Socrates says to him, Cephalus, I am really delighted to discuss with the very old, since they are like men who have proceeded on a certain road that perhaps we too will have to take. One ought, in my opinion, to learn from them what sort of road it is, whether it is rough and hard or easy and smooth. From you in particular, I should like to learn how it looks to you, for you are now at just the time of life the poets call the threshold of old age. Is it a hard time of life, or what have you to report of? Cephalus' reply to him is quite contrary. He says, essentially, it's great to be old. It's as if he's been released from a tyrannical master of his younger eros, his sexual desires and his troublemaking. He was a bit of a passionate man in his youth, you could say. Now for him being old, he's not troubled by a lot of the passions that were difficult for him as a youth. Cephalus' response is very interesting to Socrates. He plays devil's advocate with him and he says, a lot of people would say the reason that you're able to bear old age well is because you have a lot of money. It's not really got to do with character or anything. It's because you have great substance, and being rich is a real consolation. Cephalus objects to this. He says that the decent man would not bear old age with poverty very easily, near would the one who has not a decent sort ever be content with himself, even if he were wealthy. Socrates asks him, what is it that you suppose is the greatest good that you have enjoyed from possessing great wealth? The answer that he gives Socrates is essentially that he believes the greatest advantage of wealth is to make sacrifices to atone for your injustice. This is a very old Athenian idea. You would see it in the Odyssey, whereby they would make sacrifices of animals and different kinds of valuable things in order to curry favor with the gods. Essentially, you could sack a city and kill a bunch of people, but if you made the right sacrifices, the gods would leave you alone and it would be cool. Cephalus is basically saying the real advantage of having wealth is to curry favor with gods for the bad things you've done in the past. For him, his lustful and passionate deeds as a young man. And so this is his account of justice, that justice is giving each what is owed to them. Socrates objects to this definition of justice and slightly rephrases it. Shall we so simply assert that it is the truth and giving back what a man has taken from another, or is to do these very things sometimes just and sometimes unjust? Socrates provides a counterexample of a friend who lends one a weapon while he's sane, and then the friend loses his mind and comes back and asks for the weapon back while he's already insane. Would it be just then to give the insane guy his weapon back if he's going to kill himself and other people? Cephalus relents and says, oh yeah, that's right, that is an exception to the definition of justice I get. But he doesn't really engage with Socrates. He immediately says, I'm out of here. I got to go make a few sacrifices. Polemarchus' name literally means war leader. He's a young, warlike youth of Athens, and he inherits the argument from his father, but pretty much immediately defers to the authority of tradition. In this case, the tradition of the poets, one poet in particular called Simonides. Socrates presses Polemarchus with the same counter-argument that he made to his father, and Polemarchus changes the definition of justice based on Simonides. Justice is benefiting your friends and harming your enemies. A very typical definition of justice for Athenian society. Socrates raises a counter-argument to Polemarchus' definition. He says, with respect to disease and health, who is most able to do good to sick friends and bad to enemies? The answer is a doctor. And with respect to the danger of the sea, who has the power over those who are sailing? A pilot. And what about the just man? In what action with respect to what work is he most able to help friends and harm enemies? And here Polemarchus really shows his true stripes, which is that, in my opinion, it is in making war and being an ally in battle. Socrates points out, to men who are not sick, a doctor is useless. Is this definition of justice valid in times of peace like it is in times of war? Polemarchus gets a bit confused with this, and he says in terms of contracts or in terms of business, this definition of justice is all right. Of course, he's thinking in terms of war, and now he's thinking in terms of business. So he hasn't really managed to get out of these quite typical frames for justice for an Athenian young man. Socrates does some of his Socrates kung fu on Polemarchus, and as it turns out, the person who's best at benefiting one's friends and hurting one's enemies is actually a thief. Therefore, the most just person by this definition would be a thief, which clearly nobody's going to accept, that being a thief makes you the most just person in the world. Polemarchus is on the back foot here. Socrates then raises a second argument, which is that we can be wrong about who our friends are and who our enemies are. So in that case, we could think a friend is an enemy and we could hurt somebody that we should really be helping, or we could think an enemy is a friend and we could help somebody that we shouldn't be helping. This is a very important introduction here, because this is one of the key themes of the Republic, which is how do we know the difference between appearance and reality? Like somebody who appears like a friend and then somebody who's actually a friend. A real friend is somebody who doesn't just seem to be good, it's somebody who really is good. Socrates then throws a real curveball in here, which he says, is it the part of the just man to harm anybody? And Polemarchus says, it is to harm his enemies. And Socrates says, well, do horses that have become harmed become better or worse? He says, worse. What about dogs? Dogs that are harmed, do they become better or worse? Do they become worse? So Socrates says, should we not assert the same thing of human beings, that when they're harmed, they become worse in respect to human virtue? This is the first introduction of virtue here. Virtue in the Greek is arete, meaning excellence, and it's the opposite of vice, kakia, meaning bad or evil. So the assumption that there's a human virtue is the assumption that there's a human purpose or end. A knife that's really excellent at cutting things would have arete, because we know that the function of a knife is to cut. Slightly more complicated for people, but we'll discuss it as the Republic goes on. So Socrates persuades Polemarchus that it's not just to harm anybody, and that harming people makes them worse. And so now Polemarchus is on the same side as Socrates. And Socrates says, "Do you know," I said, "to whom, in my opinion, that saying belongs which asserts that it is just to help friends and harm enemies?" Says, "I suppose it belongs to Periander or Perdiccas or Xerxes or Ismenias the Theban or some other rich man who has a high opinion of what he can do." These are all tyrants, essentially. He's saying that the definition of justice for a tyrant is to help your friends and harm your enemies. It is this conclusion that calls forth the third character of this dialogue, which is Thrasymachus. Part 4. Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus' name literally means fierce fighter. He's a sophist in the sense that he's a professional teacher of rhetoric. When we are introduced to Thrasymachus, he literally jumps out like a wild animal and disturbs the dialogue that's been going on. Polemarchus and Socrates have come together. They've agreed that justice isn't benefiting your friends and harming your enemies. And Thrasymachus jumps into the fray ready to fight. Initially, Socrates is frightened by Thrasymachus because he's so wild and out of control in a sense. This is because, as a sophist, he doesn't really care about reason. He doesn't really care about the truth. He actually thinks Socrates is manipulating Polemarchus for his love of honor. He accuses him of doing it because he wants to win. This is obviously Thrasymachus' own motivations being put on Socrates, because Socrates is the lover of truth. He's doing it to try and get to what's genuinely the case. Thrasymachus can't see things like that. Socrates' response to Thrasymachus is very interesting. "Thrasymachus, don't be hard on us. If we are making any mistake in the consideration of the arguments, Polemarchus and I know well that we're making an unwilling mistake. If we were searching for gold, we would never willingly make way for one another in the search and ruin our chances of finding it. So don't suppose that when we were seeking for justice, a thing more precious than a great deal of gold, we would ever foolishly give in to one another and not be as serious as we can be about bringing it to light. Don't you suppose that, my friend, rather, as I suppose, we are not competent. So it's surely far more fitting for us to be pitied by you, a clever man, than to be treated harshly." Essentially, we're doing the best that we can, okay? We're just not very good at it. Thrasymachus obviously doesn't accept this. He says, "Hercules, here is that habitual irony of Socrates. I knew it. And I predicted to these fellows that you wouldn't be willing to answer, that you would be ironic and do anything rather than answer if someone asked you something." Socrates kind of placates Thrasymachus a lot in this dialogue. He says, "Because you're so wise, Thrasymachus, obviously you know that." And so he asks him, "Why don't you tell us a little bit about it?" Thrasymachus actually says, "I get paid for this stuff. I'm not going to do this for free. If you want me to philosophize with you, you're going to have to actually pay me." Glaucon chips in and says, "Now, for money's sake, speak, Thrasymachus, we shall all contribute to Socrates." Socrates himself doesn't charge for his teaching and is much poorer, which is an indication of his virtue in this case, that he's not greedy like the sophist. He really does care about the truth. Thrasymachus then gives his own definition of justice, which is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger. If we look at these characters as almost peeling back layers of the Athenian definition of justice, with Cephalus kind of giving a slightly noble one of, "Oh, it's for the gods," Polemarchus coming down where it's benefiting friends and harming enemies, and now Thrasymachus is laid bare where he's saying, no, justice is purely the advantage of the stronger over the weaker. Might makes right. The stronger person is the one that decides what justice is and justice isn't. There's no objective standard of justice that everybody is subject to. This is important for the mission of the Republic because Socrates is searching for a supra-individual measurement for justice. In the introductory lecture, we talked about the issue with the sophists and with the natural philosophers. And the natural philosophers looked at the world as mechanical, as material, and therefore the gods couldn't endorse virtue and vice. Socrates is looking for a solution to that. He's looking for a rational grounding to justice, to morality. Socrates makes a counter argument that the stronger in this case would be the rulers of the city, but sometimes the rulers of the city command things that aren't actually in their best interest. In this case, they would be commanding things that would be to their disadvantage. And so if everybody does what they say, the advantage of the stronger would actually be a disadvantage. Socrates adds another argument to this, which he uses with a doctor example or a shepherd, which is that the normative measure of good or bad for a doctor is the health of the patient. The normative measure of good or bad for a shepherd is the health of the sheep. So the stronger don't necessarily govern the people for their own advantage. The measurement of the ruler is the health of the ruled, or the well-being of the ruled. Socrates makes the argument that every art, from being a doctor or a shepherd or a ruler, is actually to the advantage of somebody else. Therefore, Thrasymachus' definition of justice as the advantage of the stronger collapses. This is where Thrasymachus really shows his true colours in the dialogue. Instead of contending with Socrates' argument against his, he instead makes an ad hominem argument and says, "Tell me, Socrates, do you have a wet nurse?" Thrasymachus really reveals himself more and more here. He argues that the just man always gets less than the unjust man, that it's a perpetually worse position. And so we start to see if, like Thrasymachus, you're a lover of gain or a lover of profit, justice could eat into that profit. It could be a problem for you. And so if you really want to have everything, which is what he suggests as the ultimate injustice, which is overthrowing a city, putting yourself in place, changing all of the rules and laws to benefit yourself. A complete injustice is really the greatest manifestation of justice. The end of the speech marks a change in the argument. It's no longer about the definition of justice, but an argument that the unjust life is more profitable than the just life. This argument isn't resolved, but in Book 2, when Adamantius and Glaucon beg Socrates to articulate for them why the just life is more profitable than the unjust life. Socrates asked Thrasymachus, "Answer us from the beginning. Do you assert that perfect injustice is more profitable than justice when it is perfect?" "I most certainly do assert it," Thrasymachus said, "and I've said why." "Then how do you speak about them in this respect? Surely you call one of them virtue and the other vice." "Of course." "Then do you call justice virtue and injustice vice?" "That's likely, you agreeable man," he said, "when I also say that injustice is profitable and justice isn't." "What then? The opposite," he said. "Is justice then vice?" "No, but very high-minded innocence." "Do you call injustice corruption?" "No, rather good counsel." "Are the unjust, in your opinion, good as well as prudent, Thrasymachus?" "Yes, those who can do injustice perfectly," he said, "and are able to subjugate cities and tribes of men to themselves." "As to what?" I said, "Socrates, I'm not unaware of what you want to say, but I wondered what went before you, that you put injustice in the camp of virtue and wisdom, and justice among their opposites." Thrasymachus defines virtue as vice, and vice as virtue. This is because his aim is different to Socrates. The telos of his moral compass is the tyrant. And to become a tyrant, the virtue that you have to pursue is injustice. A vice that would take you away from becoming a tyrant would be helping other people. Thrasymachus has an inverted hierarchy of justice compared to Socrates. The ideal for him would be like a tyrant that's enslaved everybody. And so anything that moves you towards becoming that tyrant is a virtue, and anything that moves you away from it is considered a vice. Socrates questions whether Thrasymachus really believes this or not, that if injustice is a virtue and justice is a vice, then wisdom would be ignorance. Socrates proves to Thrasymachus that justice is a virtue and injustice is vice and ignorance, and Thrasymachus blushes. This is a very famous part of the Republic, and rather than Thrasymachus admitting defeat, he simply blushes. And this shows the kind of literary quality of the philosophical dialogue. Thrasymachus takes a back seat now, and Socrates progresses the argument. He says, "Do you think that a city, an army, a band of robbers or thieves, or any other tribe with a common unjust purpose will be able to achieve it if they are unjust to each other?" This is the classic thing in TV shows or movies where the villain is, I'm thinking of the Penguin is a very good example of this, where he's so corrupt that he can't really even have friends or family anymore. How can they trust each other? If you're willing to betray anybody in the pursuit of your own gain, how can you have relationships with people? So even amongst unjust people, there has to be some level of justice in order for them to carry out unjust purposes together. Finally, at the end of Book 1, they return to the question of how to live. Is it better to be just or to be unjust? Is it more profitable? He provides a teleological argument in that what is the function of the soul, of the psyche of a person? And that the function of a thing is living well. Living well is an excellence. It's a virtue. Justice is the virtue and injustice is the vice. Therefore, if one is unjust, one won't be able to live well. Ergo, it's more profitable to be just than unjust. Of course, this matter isn't resolved in this book. It's going to be taken up in Book 2 and form the whole course of the Republic. Socrates concludes, "But it is not profitable to be wretched, rather it is profitable to be happy," of course. "Then, my blessed Thrasymachus, injustice is never more profitable than justice." Thrasymachus replies, "Let that," he said, "be the fill of your banquet at the festival of Bendis." Socrates. In Book 1 of the Republic, we really learn what justice isn't. We don't get a positive definition of justice, but It clears away a lot of the traditional definitions of justice, things like helping your friends and harming your enemies, or that justice is the advantage of the stronger, that simply there is no justice. It's just whoever is in charge calls the shots. So really, book one clears out a lot of this stuff in order to pursue the positive account in book two as we start to leave the cave. So join us for the next one.